This is the podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, where the world's voices converge, from ambassadors to analysts, from Houston to every corner of the globe. We go beyond the headlines, bringing you direct insights into diplomacy, global events, and the international forces shaping our future. Because understanding the world starts with listening to it.
Thank you very much, Sandhya, and it's wonderful to see all of you here. And just I always think it's important to preface, for many years we talked about in every news station, every podcast, every think tank, what was happening in Syria, one of the world's largest and most dire refugee crises. But I think it's important, and I try to always bring it back, to what's happening in Venezuela. Our neighbor, the second largest Venezuelan community in the United States lives here in Houston, or in the Houston area. It's besides the oil connections between Maracaibo and Houston, and people call it sometimes Maracaibo the Houston of Venezuela. To put it in perspective, since World War II, this is the largest economic, political, and sadly, most importantly, societal collapse of a country outside of a war and an invasion or a civil war. Rampant rates of inflation in terms of oil. Pre-Chavez went from over average, 3 million barrels a day to at one point being just barely over 500,000 barrels a day. Complete collapse, 80+% at one point of oil production and oil exports. And most dire, over 7 million Venezuelans were in such dire straits that they had to flee the country. Many of them came here, many of them went to Colombia, to Peru. Relative to the population, to help Americans get an idea of that, that's about 85 to 90 million Americans if they up and left over a course of a few years. That would be every single American who lives in the western United States, the mountain states, everyone from Colorado to California, from New Mexico, across. If every one of those states was cleared out of people, that's the relative number that have fled Venezuela. Tonight we're going to primarily focus upon oil. Francisco, we're very fortunate to have him here in Houston. He is renowned as, in my opinion, probably the best, but certainly one of the best Latin American energy experts in the world. You have consulted with numerous energy and oil ministries of various countries, big producers all around the world, all the big majors, companies in the world, the IMF, the World Bank. But maybe before we get into that, as a Venezuelan, and we will focus most of our time and your expertise as an analyst, can you tell about what it has been like as a Venezuelan these last few dramatic, but perhaps hopeful and maybe inspiring few weeks?
Sure. Thank you very much, Ronan, and thank you very much for the invitation to share with you. Happy to see a large crowd, some familiar faces, some not. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very glad that you started asking it sort of from a personal perspective, because I'm an analyst, and I pride myself of being an academic and an analyst that looks at things in a dispassionate way. But of course, I'm also proud Venezuelan, and as you pointed out, we have suffered a lot in the last quarter century, one of the most dramatic economic and political collapses in the history of the Western Hemisphere, and one of the actually worst as you pointed out, after the Second World War, without an actual war. So I have to say that this month has been a roller coaster. Personally, for me, I've been as busy as ever in my life. With my wife, we were counting that I had like 500 requests for interviews and speaking engagements and things of that nature. So it has been really crazy. And of course, as you pointed out, it's hard not to explain to everybody that is not Venezuelan, that we are happy that this guy who was a violent dictator, ruthless, that tortured people, have hundreds of political prisoners, and as you pointed out, that destroyed the Venezuelan economy. It's not just his responsibility, it's shared with Hugo Chavez and others in the regime, but without a doubt, a major contributor was Nicolás Maduro, and of course, also was involved in criminal activity. This regime has become a criminal enterprise. So see him, taken out and face justice is something that personally is something that I think most Venezuelans feel happy about. In fact, polls show recently that, Bloomberg conducted a poll, 98% of Venezuelans abroad supported, and the vast majority, even within the country, even though, of course, they're doing the poll now when you could expect some of them to be fearful. At the same time, as an analyst and as a Venezuelan, I'm also a bit disappointed that there is no clear path towards democracy in Venezuela, and that the things that have been emphasized are not about democracy or human rights, but about other issues, including, of course, the issue that I study, which is oil. And so I hope that sooner rather than later we have the start of a transition in Venezuela. I can understand as an analyst that it's not easy to transit to democracy in a country after the type of regime that we have had, and the military have to be part of a transition, and there has to be negotiations, etc. But I just hope that doesn't that we don't get distracted of that objective. I was pleasantly hearing today Secretary Rubio point towards this process and emphasize that this is the objective in the end, is having free and fair elections in Venezuela. So I hope that we can see that relatively soon. And one of the issues, of course, is that this regime has been extremely capable of adapting to different situations and surviving. And I think what they're trying to do now, of course, is again, buy some time, acquiesce to what they need to with the Trump administration, but eventually hoping that there will be something distracting the U.S. government from Venezuela, and either politically, internally in the U.S. or abroad, that will allow them to continue to stay there. And to sort of finalize there, I think it's important for non-Venezuelans to understand that the vast majority of Venezuelans, and this is not just impressions, these are polls that have been conducted recently, want Delcy Rodriguez out and want a transition to democracy. Of course, the ones who are abroad, it's even more dramatic, but I think that's the reality, and so as long as we don't have that transition, Venezuela is not going to be a prosperous, stable country. And of course, there could be bad things happening in between, but that should be the objective.
And again, I want to mostly focus upon now and kind of the possibilities, as hard as they're to define moving forward. But just for people to understand, especially for people who may not be, in the industry or from the energy sector, like myself or others in the audience, it is not as simple as if you had 500 factories in a country that were closed down for 20 years, or you had 20 great producing mines that were shut down, even if they were flooded in a country that were shut down for years. Can you explain how that collapse happened, especially maybe the key really starts in 2002, 2003, PDVSA, the state-run oil company, their strikes. Chavez at the time clears out all of the leadership, basically forces out all the people who actually know what they're doing, the experts, the analysts, the engineers. How did it collapse so badly? And in a lot of ways, can you explain why it's probably in much worse shape than people understand? Some of these facilities, it's not just they've been shut down, haven't been maintained. There were people stripping and taking parts to sell for scrap, for dollars, wherever they could, or sell parts abroad. How dire is the kind of oil infrastructure in Venezuela today, and how to get there?
Sure. So I mean, as you point out, Venezuela has been a country producing oil for a century. From the late 1920s until the late 1960s was the largest oil exporter in the world, third world producer for most of that period. And the country peaked in the early 70s, then production went down, and that's sort of a long story that we don't have time to talk about here. But then there was an oil opening in the 1990s to foreign investors, and there was a very significant increase in investment, particularly in the extra heavy oil fields of Venezuela, the so-called Orinoco Belt, which is where Venezuela has this massive resource base that is not necessarily the largest proven reserves in the world, as people claim, but it's without a doubt among the largest resources, oil resource endowments in the world. And that led to a new peak of production, 3.5 million barrels of oil before Chavez came to power. And production was expected to continue growing, above 5 million barrels of oil if the plans had continued. But Hugo Chavez comes to power. He was very critical of the oil opening to the private sector. He, at the beginning, is relatively pragmatic with private oil companies because he wants them to finish their projects, to continue to invest, right? At the same time, he has this political conflict with the national oil company, first with the leadership, so he starts firing them, and that leads to tons of political upheaval, including an oil strike in which, as you pointed out, Hugo Chavez, by the way, he confessed afterwards that he actually wanted to push that to happen because he wanted to take political control and to fire the employees of PDVSA, and he fires, about 18,000 of the 40,000 people working there. But as you pointed out, a massive amount of the top. I remember seeing the figure that more than 90% of those with a Ph.D. in PDVSA that had a very talented and well-educated workforce were fired, and of course, a ton of the management. So the massive loss of human capital in 2003 is something that the company has never ever recovered. But sadly, the country didn't realize what had happened for the following reason. First, because 1.1 million barrels of new capacity was coming online from these private investments. And second, the price of oil skyrocketed. And so the party went on. The income of the government actually went significantly up. In fact, Venezuela received the largest windfall in Latin America's recorded history. So Hugo Chavez received the country with the lowest oil price of the Venezuelan basket in real terms, and then he had the highest until he died. So the guy couldn't be luckier in that regard. So, but then, of course, Chavez, taking advantage of the high prices of the fact that he already controlled PDVSA and that the projects had come in, started to forcefully renegotiate the contracts with the foreign oil companies. And he did it in a way that was tremendously damaging to the oil sector. Not only two of the largest investors in Venezuela left, Conoco and Exxon, and went to international arbitration, and now they are owed almost $14 billion. But in addition to that, he changed the model to one in which the majority shareholder of all joint ventures or all private ventures had to be the national company. And of course, a national company with a lot of issues, but also he not only extracted as much money from the national company as he could and made them into a social ministry and development and political, absolutely politicized entity, But he also dramatically increased the debt of the national company from $3 billion to $35 billion, and the debt of the country to levels never seen before, $170 billion today, for a country that is going to be exporting $14 billion. And of course, the reason why he felt that that was possible was because he claimed to have the largest oil reserves in the world, and of course, the price of oil was so high that everything could be done. So all these things ended up producing a terrible situation that was made worse by the collapse of oil prices in 2014. And so, to give you a few figures, before Chavez, Venezuela produced 3.5 million barrels of oil, but PDVSA itself produced more than 3 million barrels with their own people, their own fields, their own capacity. By the time that Maduro gets to power, the country produces 2.8 million barrels, but PDVSA's production has collapsed to half. And by the time that US sanctions are set in place, basically, PDVSA produced less than a third of what they used to produce, and Venezuela produces 1.3 million barrels of oil. PDVSA actually at that point already was producing significantly, even like a fifth actually. So PDVSA's production today is like 80% lower than it was, and of course the private companies, some were fully expropriated. The only remaining relevant Western company in the country is Chevron. There are, Repsol and Eni from Europe produce a little bit, but the rest of the foreign partners are the Russian and Chinese national oil companies. And as you pointed out, because this is a very oil-dependent economy, that collapse in the oil sector was the main cause of the collapse in the rest of the economy that led to this massive exodus of 8 million people. So the policies were not only in the oil sector, there were widespread in terms of price controls, exchange rate controls, expropriation of all the cement sector, the steel sector, the manufacturing sector of Venezuela is absolutely destroyed. But of course, he killed the goose that laid the golden eggs too. And of course, that's the reality that we're facing now.
And to bring it up to, maybe say just before Maduro was apprehended here a few weeks ago, as we touched upon, by 2020, production had collapsed to just barely over 500,000 barrels. It's rebounded to somewhere over 1 million now. One of the reasons, better or worse, why Trump and Rubio might have a degree of, if not but confidence in Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, or I guess now technically President, is that some people credit her with kind of helping right that ship or improve the production of oil and exports of oil for Venezuela, improving governmental revenues, kind of. It's a very poor and a bad economy, but stabilizing it to a degree. How do you see her role? And is it true that in some ways, in a quote-unquote socialist country, she was quietly privatizing some aspects of the market, doing deals here and there, so the low-hanging fruit of where production would be increased could move forward? But how do you see her role of all this?
So, I mean, as I mentioned, production had collapsed to 1.3 million barrels before U.S. sanctions, but then, of course, U.S. sanctions plus secondary sanctions to countries that bought oil from Venezuela and of course, COVID. In 2020, the reason why Venezuela's oil production collapsed even further was because COVID reduced dramatically oil demand, and the price of Venezuelan oil went to $7 in the summer of 2020, and so basically they couldn't even cover the cost of production. So they had to shut in 500,000 barrels of production, and that took time to recover. So I don't think we can give any credit to Delcy Rodriguez for the reopening of the spare capacity. In fact, that was mostly done by this corrupt Minister of Oil, Tarek El Aissami, who led that process. But then Delcy Rodriguez did, with her brother, negotiate with the Biden administration the license to get Chevron back into investing in Venezuela, and 80% of the growth after the recovery of the spare capacity was basically Chevron investing in Venezuela. Of course, as I recall, the reason, or the sort of strategy of the Biden administration was to bring elections, to sort of keep some sanctions relief and bring elections to happen. And they did happen, and of course the opposition won, but the government basically committed massive fraud. But I think the pragmatism that it's true that existed in those years in terms of allowing, for example, the de facto dollarization of the economy, the price controls were not enforced anymore. They're still in the books, but they were not enforced. The fact that they did allow some contracts in the oil sector that were not in the law, they are legalizing them just now. Those things did help a little bit to stabilize the economy, but particularly the main reason why it stabilized it was just reopening of the oil production because of the recovery of the world oil demand, and of course also because Chevron's investment. I think it's important to understand something. Both Delcy Rodriguez and her brother, who is the president of the National Assembly, are pragmatic, but they are not moderate, as some newspapers seem to think. They are quite radical. In fact, their objective in life is revenge because their father was a guerrilla leader that died in prison, and they have themselves, they find themselves as die-hard revolutionaries who will not let the revolution down. At the same time, of course, not only they know that to survive they needed to do some of these reforms, but now they know that they have to acquiesce or comply with what the Trump administration is asking them, otherwise they will be out of power. And the US keeps having the capacity of a naval blockade of the oil exports on the one hand, and of course this operation was so militarily so spectacularly successful that they fear tremendously another operation, and the Venezuelan air defenses are completely decimated, and so they basically know that they are at the mercy of the US military at this point.
And I suppose it might surprise people somewhat, like the 1970s, 1980s, the height of the Cold War, Soviet Union and Western Europe were, they were receiving large amounts of oil and gas from the Soviets. In some of the worst years of U.S. relations with both under Chavez and then later under Maduro, they were still exporting large amounts of oil to the United States, primarily to the refineries in Texas, Louisiana, because we have the capacity for that heavy crude. Can you also touch upon, you mentioned it, because we think of these ghost tankers for Russian oil going all around the world to who knows where. How has Venezuela been getting their oil out?
Sure. So during the period of sanctions, to give you an example, last year, before the U.S. blockade started and the seizure of some tankers, 80% of Venezuela's oil was going to the black market in China. So Venezuela was exporting about 850,000 barrels of oil. Some 140,000 were coming to the U.S. because of Chevron's license. About 4% was going to Cuba and all the rest to China. And it was with this shadow fleet that this started when sanctions were imposed on Iran a few years back. The Iranians developed this shadow fleet to they created, companies, that shell companies that are, created in a variety of places around the world, but some in Dubai, for example, that last only for a few weeks in their activity. They, have these tankers that impersonate other tankers. They call them ghost ships because they basically have a false flag, a false name. Sometimes they are tankers that were going to be sent for scrap, and they have a last 2 trips doing this. And that grew very significantly over the years because Iran is a major producer and exporter of oil. But then, of course, when you added Venezuelan sanctions and Russian sanctions, you have 10% of the world oil going in the dark fleet. And that made it really easy for Venezuela to export oil that way. And basically, the biggest buyer of Venezuela's oil were small refineries in China that are not designed to process this heavy oil. The only reason why they wanted it was because it was sold to them at very significant discounts. And so they blended it with a lighter oil and they could process it. As you point out, now what is happening is most of that oil is being redirected to the United States. The US does that has this demand and capacity to process this heavy oil because in the 1990s, the Gulf Coast refineries made tons of investment to process heavy oil because that was the oil that they had available from Venezuela and Mexico, and it seemed to be going up. Whereas, remember that the production in Texas was going down in the 1990s, and until the shale revolution, there was basically heavy oil was the name of the game. So of course things changed dramatically afterwards, but they still have that capacity and they demand a lot of that oil. Canada has supplied some of that oil, but the infrastructure is not there to get all the oil in a cheap way to the U.S., to the Gulf Coast. They do get a lot to the Midwest, but to here it's just a fraction. And of course, the Keystone XL pipeline was never built, which would have brought 800,000 barrels of Canadian oil to the Gulf Coast. Mexico's production has been also falling. Mexico now is refining also more oil in Mexico. So there is a lack of heavy oil. And of course, refiners are very happy of finding this oil coming here. The advantage, of course, for Venezuela is that now that oil will not be sold at 30% discount, but at 10% discount. And that I'm talking about with respect to Brent, and that of course will significantly increase the money that they get. Of course, now they get it through the U.S. government, which is a very unusual situation. So far, they are depositing the money in the Qatar National Bank, and they just exchanged $500 million that they sent to Venezuelan banks. And so we have to see how this will evolve, but this is sort of the short-term thing. The other thing that will happen probably very soon, I mean, Chevron is getting an expanded license. They will continue to invest. They will probably step up their investment. Chevron produces 25% of the oil in Venezuela, and they have a significant cash flow coming from Venezuela, so they can reinvest. So for them, it's a low-risk investment. They have a lot of the infrastructure needed, et cetera. For bigger investments in greenfield projects, meaning in projects that do not have the infrastructure already there, it's much riskier. And that's why you probably have heard that the CEO of Exxon said that Venezuela is uninvestable, and which President Trump didn't like. But the bottom line is that from the perspective of a company that is outside of the country, like Exxon or Conoco, making these large investments in the extra heavy oil is a long-term proposition. It's billions of dollars with 30 years of maturity investments. You will not take that decision without a lot of guarantees of political stability, of an institutional framework that respects the rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, those things are not in place right now. And let me just finish on that by saying that there are other types of short-term investments with the existing infrastructure of PDVSA, even though as you pointed out, the infrastructure is in very bad shape. There are plenty of areas with spare capacity in the infrastructure too. And there are these declining fields that American companies, independent companies, can significantly turn around and increase production with investments that could pay off very quickly because, as I mentioned, it's just drilling some wells using new technology and the infrastructure is there. And that's what is is creating a lot of excitement in Texas about the possibility of some of these companies going back there. One issue is that Delcy Rodriguez gave this type of contracts, 13 of those, to a lot of her cronies, and some of the companies that she gave them to are even sanctioned by the US because of involvement in Iranian oil trade. And so there are a couple of legitimate companies among the list that have those contracts, but that and the issue of the massive role that the Russians and the Chinese have in terms of oil fields in Venezuela, in terms of reserves, I think are two of the biggest challenges. That, you know, it's not that easy to create new contracts for new entrants from the US without solving these issues.
Maybe just to touch upon, you mentioned some of the big international players. The Chavez-Maduro regime would not have survived without Chinese dollars, Russian support, a lot of that military equipment. Although Putin may not like having someone else putting more barrels on the market, the Cubans sadly provided most of the intelligence to make basically Venezuela a surveillance state, or a horrific state where the government's watching everything. You mentioned Iran, Hezbollah, both have presences there. But in the terms of oil and money and what the Venezuelans will owe, you mentioned China. I know they are owed at minimum $10 billion. They probably have rights or kind of promised royalties on certain fields, and maybe some of those same fields have been promised to other Western companies before Chavez, all that other stuff. How is China, do you think, going to be placated? And so far, they seem to be relatively quiet, but how do you see China dealing with all of this?
Sure. So, as you point out, China gave Hugo Chavez over the years $62 billion, the largest recipient of Chinese loans. At the same time, those loans were being repaid with oil, and so a significant part of those loans were repaid. But the balance is very significant. We don't know the exact number, but as you pointed out, it's at least 10 billion. I think it's probably north of 14 billion. What they're still making China the largest creditor of Venezuela, Conoco being the second. So the Chinese were just getting barely paid because of U.S. sanctions. The National Company of China decided that they didn't want to challenge the U.S., and so they were only getting paid a small amount of interest. The rest, as I mentioned, was going to the black market, not to the Chinese National Oil Company. But as you mentioned, China, so after Chevron that produces 25%, you have the Russians producing 11% of Venezuela's oil and the Chinese 10%. The Chinese have invested very little since Chavez died because they have been very unhappy with the conditions in Venezuela and the partnership with the National Oil Company. But they do want their debt paid, and they did pay signing bonuses for some of these oil fields that, even though they haven't developed, they feel that they have the right over those contracts. Similar is the case of the Russians. In fact, if you add the Russians and the Chinese, they have the largest portion of reserves outside of the national company. So this is going to be a big issue for them. The Trump administration apparently did offer PetroChina, which is the affiliate of this company that owns the assets in Venezuela, some of the oil that they are marketing right now through Vitol and Trafigura, which are two traders. And according to Reuters, the Chinese said, no, thank you. We are not buying it for now. Of course, they feel, I mean, we shouldn't pay. This is, we are owed that oil. And so let's see how, as you know, the sort of so-called Donroe doctrine wants the Chinese and the Russians out of this hemisphere, at least in a significant way. And so we have to see what happens with those projects and that debt repayment. In the case of the Russians, Venezuela paid all the debt to the Russians on the oil side because the Russians very smartly took over the marketing of Venezuela's oil during the first part of the sanctions, and they got themselves paid. But they still owe some money from military equipment that Chavez bought. And of course, they own a lot of assets. To give you an idea, the expectation was that Russia was going to be producing in those fields 1 million barrels of oil per day, which is currently all of Venezuela's production, but they are just producing 110,000. So they should be producing 10 times as much. So yeah, there are some very important geopolitical ramifications here. And finally, you mentioned Iran and Cuba. I wanted just to mention that Cuba is in a very tough position because Venezuela was supplying about half of the requirements of oil for Cuba, and Cuba is a country that depends on oil not just for transportation. They depend on oil for keeping the lights on, electricity. And so, given that the US is also pressuring Mexico, which is the other supplier to Cuba, not to supply in the same way, Cuba is going to get they were already in a very bad shape economically, and they're going to get in even worse. And so one of the question marks is Secretary Rubio going to prioritize regime change in Cuba in the next year or so, and that perhaps makes him less interested in regime change in Venezuela. That's a concern. Not that I don't want regime change in Cuba, but as a Venezuelan. But at the same time, I think for the Cuban regime, this is a major blow. And for the Iranian regime, it's not that significant economically, et cetera, but of course it's a very important international ally.
I just want to do two more questions to kind of wrap it all up, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. I will say it's probably not a coincidence, but I was at one of your energy roundtables in December with some former leadership from PDVSA, and you even then, for a year or two, have said it's at least $100 million to rebuild just a basic level of the infrastructure. You touched upon Exxon saying here recently, currently Venezuela is uninvestable. I think their CEO had said we've had our assets nationalized there twice, I guess the 1970s, and then not just the rights to reserves, but a lot of the equipment, everything under Chavez. Whereas Chevron's CEO, who we hosted in October, obviously they made the big gamble, which maybe has paid off, to stay in Venezuela. They didn't leave when Exxon left, ConocoPhillips, others left. They said, in essence, we're here for the present, and we hope to be there to support the Venezuelans through the future. Can you talk about the realities of American major oil companies getting involved again, or more involved in Conoco's case in Venezuela, and really, like you mentioned some of your great reporting, that the risk is not below ground. We know what's there. Venezuela's blessed by what's there. It's above ground risk. It's how do you guarantee contracts? How do you ensure political stability? How do you protect capital that's been invested? You talk about kind of the realities from just the hard-nosed sense and risks these companies may or may not be willing to take.
Sure. I just wrote a piece in America's Quarterly, if you want to check it out, and it's exactly that point, right? Venezuela's risks are all above ground compared to below ground risks. The geology is amazing. The resources are there. The reserves are huge. And even though the oil is extra heavy and that is sold at a discount and is harder to transport and to refine, the cost of production in Venezuela are actually relatively low compared to the US or Canada, for example. So there is a massive potential, but if you get things above ground right. To give you one example, I did a sort of a counterfactual exercise. Let's imagine that the resources that are in the Orinoco Belt in Venezuela, the extra heavy oil, is magically moved to Texas or to Alberta in Canada with the exact same sort of geology and capacity to extract. Well, Venezuela could be producing 6 million barrels of oil, so 6 times as much as it produces today. Even, Alberta and the US and Texas, of course, are great jurisdictions to produce oil. So let's imagine that it's not as perfect for oil producers, but more like Brazil, which is the best Latin America case in terms of institutions. Probably they will be producing 4 million barrels of oil, 4.5, 5. So there is tremendous potential. But a lot of things have to align, right? The first one is anyone investing billions of dollars, as you mentioned, the figure is more than 100 billion to get back to the peak production of Venezuela, and that will take perhaps a decade, perhaps a little bit less. That would require a company to think or to be pretty sure that US sanctions are not coming back, right? And governments change in the US, circumstances change. So without a stable democracy in Venezuela that has good relations with the US, I don't think that's gonna happen, first. Second, of course, Venezuela needs to have a very different institutional framework that really protects investors' rights and that creates competitive conditions for investment in Venezuela. And that requires something that the country has lacked, which is a consensus among the leadership and the population to open up the oil sector to private investment. Because the national company is bankrupt, Venezuela owes $170 billion that cannot repay, and the oil industry can only be recovered by private investment. So if that consensus doesn't exist, Maria Corina Machado is a very supportive of private investment in the oil sector, and you might think that even Delcy Rodriguez now is, but we know that this is a tactical thing. So are we going to go in that direction? Finally, of course, political stability. I mean, even though oil companies operate, all over the world in some places that are not, very easy to operate, it's important for them to have at least the guarantee that some contract stability and some political stability. So all that is going to be needed. Finally, some people have asked me, I think, a very interesting question. Why do you say that we need a transition to democracy and institutions, etc., if oil is producing dictatorships all over the world? Which is true, but first, the dictatorships that really produce a lot, or the authoritarian regimes that really produce a lot of oil, they tend to be in the Middle East, in a place where the cost of production is extremely low and extremely easy to produce oil. You don't need the investment that you need in Venezuela, or you don't need the private sector. They have, in fact, national companies. Some of those are relatively efficient, some are very inefficient, and still they can produce tons of oil. But second, think about this. Venezuela has a tradition of democracy. The region is democratic with exceptions. So I think it's really hard to think that Venezuela can be a country that gets hundreds of billions of dollars, more than $100 billion of investment without being a democracy and have great relations with their neighbors and with the United States, etc. So that's why I really think that if we stay with this current regime, we will get some oil recovery. We will get to 1.3, 1.4 million barrels perhaps with the pressure of the US. But that will not lead to Venezuela developing its potential and to the country to be wealthy again and to millions of Venezuelans to come back.
And then just to put it all together, to bring it back to, you mentioned that the political question is probably the biggest of all. You mentioned Delcy Rodriguez, a recent payment direct to Venezuela, in essence from the United States, $500 million through the Gulf. But how much does that money do to help stabilize an awful and repressive regime, even if the guy at the top's gone, now number two's in the lead? And we haven't talked about her much, but you can discuss it as much as you feel comfortable. Maria Corina Machado is the person who should be the president, the rightful president of Venezuela right now. She was banned from the election by Maduro a little over a year and a half ago. But all of the polling, she is still ahead, still seen as the most legitimate leader within Venezuela and definitely outside of Venezuela. Her surrogate candidate, Mundo, kind of an elderly figure who stepped in, he more than likely easily won the election. How do you see her very difficult position of trying to maintain a principled stance in defiance and against negotiating with this regime, but at the same time, the United States, the most important country in the world for her, is working with the regime? How are those cycles working?
Sure. As I said, I'm happy to hear that Secretary Rubio talked about the steps towards a transition and that the objective is free and fair elections. At the same time, you are right that there's going to be a boost to the Venezuelan economy, particularly if this money is going to be sent back as it has started to happen this last week. The Venezuelan currency stabilized. The perception that inflation, that hyperinflation was a real possibility again. Venezuela had one of the the third worst hyperinflation in history, and the inflation rate was very high, but not hyperinflation in the last few years. So there was the concern that hyperinflation was coming back again. Now that prospect is probably not going to happen, and the economy is going to grow from a tiny level. Just to give you one striking fact, Venezuela's economy last year was the size of the economy of the GDP of Boulder, Colorado. And I tell you that town because I live there, and it's a small town. You know, it's a nice town. It's wealthy, but you know, it's a small town, and all the GDP of Venezuela was equivalent to Boulder, Colorado. Of course, the GDP of Venezuela should be the size of at least Houston, if not Texas. Unlikely ever to be Texas. But bottom line, the recovery can make her, more stable by giving more money to the regime and also increasing some of her support. Maria Cornelia Machado does have to, at the same time, I know she needs the Trump administration as an ally, without a doubt, and I think Secretary Rubio has been an ally of the Venezuelan opposition, but at the same time, she needs to press from within and outside the country for this transition not to be postponed. And as you point out, the numbers are striking still today. Maria Cornelia Machado has 5 or 6 times more approval than Delcy Rodriguez. And so the country wants political change. There is no doubt about that. The question is how to bring about that political change without destabilizing the country and in a way that, that really allows the country to recover, etc. And that will require a lot of negotiations. So hopefully that starts this year and eventually happens sooner rather than later.
Just 2 good questions kind of related, so I'll combine them. Brett asks, have U.S. sanctions done more harm than good to the Venezuelan citizens? It's always the difficulty of it. The people at the top can usually figure out how to work around them. And related to that, Elizabeth asks, does deploying U.S. oil giants to extract value take away from national prosperity, and what are the long-term impacts, basically upon, I suppose, the assets of a people and of a country, if it's seen again as just kind of an aggressive kind of take all you can type policy?
Sure. On the first one was the sanctions. Yeah, the sanctions, no doubt, contributed to the decline of the Venezuelan economy. There is a debate among my colleagues who are macroeconomists. I'm a specialist on energy, but clearly it did impact the oil sector, and therefore my sort of best guess is that it impacted the rest of the economy. At the same time, the pragmatism that the regime has now on the economy came because they had to, liberalize the economy because of sanctions. But no doubt that oil production was less and recovered less rapidly because U.S. sanctions were in place. It also led to more corruption in the oil sector because, the exports to China were done through these dark channels. And so that contributed to a crony, group of oligarchs around the government that stole a significant amount of money. So at the same time, I'm not advocating for U.S. sanctions, but the U.S. sanctions did bring, Maduro back to the table of negotiation, which led to the elections, which led to the show of the fraud of the government, that they legitimize Maduro and open up the possibility for what we saw later. So I am not necessarily in favor of sanctions, because I think that they by themselves could do a lot of harm to people without necessarily producing regime change. But I think it's one of the tools to pressure an authoritarian regime if combined with other elements. And you can see that the threat of the blockade is exactly what has forced Delcy Rodriguez to basically cooperate with the Americans. It's also, of course, the threat of military action, but the regime was basically completely cut out of any resources after the blockade, and so they were really forced to negotiate.
And then just the second part of it was, in a bigger, broader picture, you especially every country has energy assets. In Latin America, you're ex-Bron, but also you know a lot about the Middle East, other parts of the world.
Sure.
You know, what are the risks, again, of kind of a recurring cycle of the country and most people seeing these outside foreign countries, companies, in this case American companies, controlling what should be Venezuelan assets, and what does it do to the country?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important issue. You know, the mentality in most Latin American countries and other regions of the world, in the developing world, is what we call resource nationalism. It's the idea that this is our wealth and foreigners want to take it from us. Of course, the reality is slightly different in the sense that oil companies, when they go to these countries, pay very high taxes. In fact, if you consider the big picture, you can get a much bigger pie with a slightly, perhaps, not even necessarily, but a slightly lower government share or government take, but a much bigger pie that leads to much more revenue for the country and much more revenue even for the government if you take the long view and allow for private investment. Of course, that does require a well-designed tax system and institutional system so that the companies do pay a relevant amount of taxes. And that can be designed, that has been designed, you know, that has been, for example, the recent reforms that Mexico unfortunately reversed, did have that feature. In many places in the world, you know, in Brazil, there are auctions in which government companies bid how much they pay the government. This can be perfectly done in Venezuela. However, a lot of Venezuelans traditionally have thought that if the oil is not in the hands of a national oil company, they will not benefit. And the fact that this could be seen as the US imposing an oil opening over Venezuela could eventually lead to another cycle of resource nationalism. And that's why I'm concerned, because I would much better prefer that the country comes to a national consensus. I think most Venezuelans realize how disastrous that model was for the country. I think they are willing to give a try to a much more market-oriented and to bring foreign investment in, but at the same time, they need to feel that it's done in a way that will benefit the country, that is not just in the interest of foreign companies. So I have to say that I think this is an important issue for the future of the country, that this is done right.
And just a quick follow-up on that. You opened Venezuela 1920s, 1960s, one of the world's major oil producers and exporters. Also a foundational member, a key member, not just a member, but is creating OPEC. Obviously, very good, great decision idea for those oil ministers who designed it. You mentioned resource nationalism. In a lot of ways, that really started in Venezuela, didn't that? That's a concept that really started in the 1950s or 60s before it got to other parts of the world. So the Venezuelans have a long, proud history of dealing with these concepts and ideas. And do you think, hopefully, if things are done right here the next few years, it could be a model for other countries going forward?
I hope, but as we discussed before, I think we have to wait and see. You know, I think there is a lot of change of mentality in the region and in Venezuela because of the failed policies of the past, but I wouldn't, you know, completely bet on the idea that resource nationalism will disappear. In fact, we have seen it just very recently in Mexico, right? Mexico could be a country that generates much more wealth in the oil sector, significantly more. But because of ideological a vision of López Obrador, basically the country is dramatically limiting the potential of the development of the oil sector there. And so in Venezuela, since things have been much more dramatic, I think Venezuelans have learned the lesson the harder way. But I cannot rule out that this might happen again. And that's why you have to design the institutional framework in a way that the country feels confident about the benefits of it. Let me give you one important factoid. Outside of the US and Canada, and more recently, but this is very early, Guyana, all significant oil producers in the world are dominated by a state-owned company. And so that seems to be the common equilibrium to which these countries tend to go. And so the US and Canada are actually exceptions to the rule. And so that tells you a lot of what you need to know in terms of how there has to be a balance between public and private sector in the oil industry in these countries.
Okay, two great questions to kind of conclude everything and bring it together. Obviously, at the end of the day, what happens in Venezuela needs to be determined by Venezuelans, but hopefully positive support from the United States can be beneficial. Lucas asked, where do American goals and Venezuelan goals for regime change overlap and then or diverge? And then there's not a name on this, it's okay, but someone asked, what policies, if any, could the U.S. support to help return Venezuela to a democratic state?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the Trump administration had made very clear that they are not in the business of regime change that previous administrations in the U.S. were more focused on. I think Secretary Rubio has a clear goal to bring democracy back into the country. And I think there are a lot of political forces within the U.S. that want that same result. You could see the bipartisan support today in Congress, including for Maria Corina Machado's visit. But at the same time, of course, the Trump administration is in a position now in which they can sort of remote control the country without, bringing that change. And so that's why I think it's important to, put some pressure into finding a path that might not be immediate, but that leads to steps to use that massive power that the United States has today over the regime in Venezuela to make them do steps to eventually have free and fair elections, and that this is not like a transition that never happened and that they just bought time and were able to continue to remain as a authoritarian regime for a long period of time.
We wrap up, just to kind of follow up, as Sandy mentioned at the beginning, please join us next week on February 3rd. We'll host Ambassador Michelle Gavin for an excellent program, a different part of the world, how urban youth are shaping Africa's future, and in particular its politics. The week after that, something a little more maybe lighthearted, we have a program on Leo the 14th, America's first pope, his view of the world, and also, quietly, the Vatican has more influence than we might consider, especially in terms of negotiating between countries. For instance, we mentioned Cuba. They were instrumental in some of the previous negotiations with Cuba. And then just maybe two to look out for at the end of the month, on February 25th, we'll be hosting former U.S. Special Envoy Roger Carstens, who is basically the United States' lead hostage negotiator, who worked under both Biden and both Trump. I think an example of his true professionalism and bipartisanship that both presidents asked him to work for him. And then the last program of the month, it's on a Saturday. Just make note of that. It's a little bit different as when he was available. I'll be hosting Pulitzer Prize winner John Meacham on his kind of seminal book regarding it's hard to imagine, the 250th anniversary of the United States this year. And we will kind of come back when it's possible the next 2 or 3 months to have a program looking more at the politics and the opposition and leadership of Venezuela. I'd invite you all to come to that when we have that lined up. But again, I want to say just a long-time great friend of the council, besides being such an expert and one of the best people I know at this, and putting it in a manner that I, as a novice, can understand, who's not in the industry. I will say, Francisco, it was wonderful to have you again. Please all join me in thanking Francisco Monaldi.
Thank you very much.